Those images that you just saw are of 3 Israeli men released last Saturday from Hamas captivity. For 16 months, they have been held in the underground tunnels, tortured, starved, and they were very frail and gaunt and unsteady on their feet. Hamas has just said that they're no longer going to release hostages. Israel is, of course, very alarmed, and President Trump has said, basically, just get them all out, release them all, and release them all by Saturday at noon or else. So here we are again in an impossible situation, and we're joined today by the amazing Yaakov Katz, a very good friend of the state of Tel Aviv, and he and I are going to discuss what's going on and what it all means for the hostages and future of Gaza. Stay with us. Hello, Yaakov. How are you today?
Anxious, concerned, a bit wet from the rain, but more concerned about the national dilemma that I think we face at the moment.
Oh, talk about an understatement. Dilemma. I can't keep up anymore. I really can't. And I'm pretty good. But it's beyond an insane pace, right? And everything's vague and crazy. But here we are. And we're going to try to make sense of it all and make sense of it for our listeners. And it's Wednesday afternoon. It's about 2:30 in Israel, which means it's 7:30 in the morning in North America, Eastern time. So by the time we get this out in a few hours, I'm sure that everything will have changed. But it's current now, right? We're going to talk about everything in the next half hour, and we're going to start with the hostages. There are about 75 hostages remaining in Gaza. We know that they're not all alive. We don't really know much more than that. And we also can assume, based on the horrific condition of the 3 men who were released on Saturday, just a few days ago, Eli Sharabi, Ohad Ben Ami, and Or Levy, that the rest are at the edge. I mean, we know now about the conditions in which they're being held, how they're being treated. They're being starved. They're being tortured. They're in the tunnels. Many are shackled, it seems, or we've been hearing, to walls for 16 months in tunnels. And it's the younger men. It's the men who Hamas has decided are of fighting age, of military age, and their brutality, it seems, knows no bounds. President Trump made an extraordinary statement in the Oval the other day, went on for about 9-10 minutes, saying they got to get out now. Enough of this one day, 2 the next day, 3 no. All of them out now, or all hell to pay by noon on Saturday. And then he sort of qualified it a little and said, well, it's Israel's decision. I can't tell them what to do or predict, but I'll tell you, basically, if it was me, here's what I'd say. And then we had a security cabinet last night that went 4 or 5 hours in Israel. And the messaging coming out of that, to me, was vague. It was like, well, we don't want to tear up this so-called agreement, but we want them all out. So we want at least 3 out by Saturday, and then we'll continue. Then we'll consider the agreement to still be in force. And then I heard something about maybe it's 9 or what's going on, Yaakov?
I wish I knew. I think what's happening is a bit chaotic, and the chaos is a result, to some extent, of 2 major factors. The first is, let's not forget, Viv, and you and I both know this. We are dealing with a barbaric, cynical terrorist organization that cannot be trusted. These are human monsters. We saw that on Saturday when Eli, Or, and Ohad came home, and the way they looked, evoking memories that we thought were long in our past and unfortunately are not. And that's one. So they cannot be trusted. We cannot believe a word they say. They play games. That's one. And this was always going to be chaotic as a result. The second reason there's chaos is Donald Trump, and he reigns through chaos. This is how he likes to do things. And he has thrown a million wrenches into this whole ceasefire, with all of his statements about pulling the civilian population out of Gaza, evacuating Gaza, rebuilding Gaza, taking ownership of Gaza, now not allowing the Palestinians to return to Gaza. So there's that conversation. And then there was the bombshell that he dropped where he said by noon on Saturday, he wants everyone home. Not one, not two, not a drib or a drab, as he said, everyone. But then comes the Israeli cabinet, and you had 4 different messages that came out. One was, we want the hostages in the deal to continue. 2 was, we support the president's plan. 3 was, we want at least the hostages in the first stage of the deal, the remaining living hostages, which are apparently 9. That's the 9 you referred to. So the 9 out of the first batch of 33, we've already gotten some, those who are alive. We have 9 more alive. Get those home, and we want them by Saturday. But then there was a walk back on that too. No, we want everyone by Saturday, which is about, give or take, 40 living hostages out of the 75 more or less left in Gaza. We want them back. So I think what's happening here is Israel doesn't really know how to play this. Because what happens, and this is the dilemma, I think, for Israel, what happens if come Saturday, Hamas releases 3 hostages, 4 hostages? Does Netanyahu say, well, it wasn't the 9 or it wasn't the 40, so I'm resuming the fighting and intense, as he called it, intense fighting? Right. Or does he say, 1 second, they released 3 or 4. But what if they don't release any? Then you definitely have a reason to resume fighting. And what if they release 9? So what does that mean? I think we're just in a very difficult position at the moment. And I don't know that Israel knows exactly what it's going to do based on the different scenarios, and we'll have to figure it out as it happens.
So there's also this issue of Egypt being very resistant to Trump's overtures and demands and conditions, terms, whatever you want to call them. Correct me if I'm wrong, but President al-Sisi is refusing to travel to Washington to meet with President Trump. He's rejecting outright any and all conditions that Trump sets out, articulates with respect to relocating the people in Gaza until some more permanent solution can be found, whether that's rebuilding the Gaza Strip. Obviously, it has to be demilitarizing and removing Hamas, but there's all that stuff in flux. And there's a buildup, a military buildup on the border between Egypt and Israel by the Egyptian army, right? It's a bit of a flashback 40, 50 years. Like you see these rows and rows of tanks. So it's like, what's going on there? Is it for show? Is it real? I mean, they're not going to be invading Israel with tanks. What's that whole sidebar about?
Yeah. First of all, President Sisi, according to reports as of now, has decided to postpone any visit to Washington. I'm guessing that he saw what happened to Jordan's King Abdallah on Tuesday when he was not necessarily, I want to say ambushed in the Oval Office, but visibly shaken by comments that President Trump made in his presence. What King Abdallah did reveal, though, was that there's going to be some sort of meeting of Arab leaders hosted by MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, where the Arabs are going to try to come up with their own proposal for Donald Trump. So, by the way, I mean, that's a positive development, has to be said. Like, we didn't have any of this going on before. And Trump's chaos, like we mentioned, is making progress, right? Is getting them to get their act together. So they might not yet open up their borders, say, hey, 2 million Palestinians come on into Jordan, but something is moving in some direction, so we'll have to wait to see. But Sisi has said, I'm not coming. Now, at the same time, the Americans are threatening to suspend the foreign military aid, financial aid that they provide Egypt with annually. It's a couple $2 billion. This has been going on since the Camp David Accords when Israel and Egypt made peace back in 1979. Alongside that, they're building up forces along the border with Israel. If you ask me, it's a message, right? It's, if America stops the funding, we will see the peace treaty that has been in force for now almost 50 years, but we will see this as violated. And who knows what's going to happen? So, everybody is kind of signaling in different ways. I wouldn't be necessarily immediately worried of a war in the South, but this is obvious of great concern. Look, Israel's interests here has to be said, and Netanyahu can't say this publicly because he can't seem to defy the president. But do we want 2 million Palestinians from Gaza, including Hamas members in Jordan, where they could undermine the reign of King Abdullah, who might not be Netanyahu's best friend, but has kept our eastern border quiet for the last, together with his father, 60 years almost, probably, since the 1967 war. Do we need that to be now a volatile border and be undermined? Do we want them going into Egypt, into the Sinai, where we also have a relatively quiet border? So, and do we want the peace treaty with Egypt to be violated and for the Egyptians now to say, well, there goes that treaty? So Israel has a lot of other interests here beyond just what's going to happen to the people of the Gaza Strip, right? And we have a bigger region that we have to be concerned about as well.
So I can't help myself, but I'm having flashbacks to the 70s, or maybe it was the 60s, when Nasser was kind of he was pushed away from the West and into the arms of the Soviet Union. And so for decades, Egypt was secular. I mean, this was the age of pan-Arabism, secularism, the Ba'ath Party, which probably most people covering the news and geopolitics today maybe not even remember. But it wasn't pan-Islamism. It wasn't this kind of Islamofascism that we now contend with several decades later. What happened with Egypt, though, was they were pushed into, or they felt they were pushed into the arms of the Soviets. And the Soviets supplied, until Camp David, most of their weapons and military hardware. And Egypt doesn't have many levers. It's a poor country, got a lot of people, and Trump can threaten to pull military aid, but then Russia's going to come along, or China, right? And I'm sure that people behind the scenes are considering this as part of the calculation, but it's a much more complicated situation than it might seem on the surface. I'll threaten you, I'll pull your aid. Well, President Trump, you may want to think 2 or 3 times before you throw that grenade out. Qatar. Qatar finances Hamas. Qatar has the levers with respect to Hamas. Why doesn't Qatar pick up the phone and say to Mohammed Sinwar, you've got to let them all go now. You have to. Or we're just not going to give you any more money.
Well,
I know, but I have to try.
No. I'm laughing because I'm thinking to myself, unlike some of the officials who used to work in the prime minister's office, I was never on the Qatari payroll.
Right.
Right. So, it's difficult for me to talk in the name of Qatar. And to those who don't know what I'm talking about, there was a report earlier this week that without getting into the whole story, but someone who's now under investigation for leaking classified information, who was a spokesperson for Netanyahu, was also on the payroll providing consulting services to Qataris to how to improve their image, whatever.
During this war.
While he was working for the PM and during this war. Yes, thank you.
No conflict. But hang on, I have to add one more thing to that. The prime minister did deny ever having known of this guy. Remember, initially he tried that?
Right, although you kind of did see him on the helicopter sitting next to the prime minister and getting off. But he didn't know who he was. He must have thought he was like the bag guy or whatever, the guy who carries the bag. I don't know. But so I think that Hamas here understands also to a great extent what the future holds for it, right? Let's take the scenario that they release all the hostages on Saturday. You and I would be ecstatic. The country would be ecstatic. And let's say even Israel were to say, okay, fine, we agree to stop. We'll pull our forces out, guarantee no more war. Hamas doesn't trust Israel, doesn't trust Trump. So if they give up all their cards and all the leverage that they have, which are the hostages, then they know they're going to be invaded. If they hold on to some hostages, that gives them some leverage to keep some pressure on the Israeli public and on the Israeli politicians. The Qataris have always played a double game. I think we know that. And ever since this whole war began, you and I spoke here numerous times about why don't they kick them out? Why don't they stop the funding? Why don't they arrest them? I mean, there's a million things they could have done. But this is the Qatari MO. We've seen it with the Taliban. We've seen it with the with Hamas, and we're seeing it now that they're being floated as a potential meeting place for the Russians and the Ukrainians. They like to play this game of always being on both sides of the fence, and they can support both sides, even though one side is clearly a bad side, as in this case of Hamas. And then when they're needed, they're the best friend. And remember, I think it was Blinken or Biden who said they're one of our closest non-NATO allies. I mean, for heaven's sake, a government that provides sanctuary to the modern time bin Laden is one of America's closest non-NATO allies. There's something wrong with that situation.
Well, I want to just sort of spread the love and recognize the Obama administration. And my peer at the time, the then U.S. ambassador to Israel, shared the same sentiments with me about what a great and strong and reliable ally Qatar was. I mean, I get the game, but like we're way, way into overtime now. It's over. The game is over. And continuing to play it like this, I mean, it's just worse than offensive. But so Qatar is playing their game.
But can I just say one thing on that point, Viv? Because it's
Yeah.
interesting. You got me thinking. Trump has been talking a lot about Egypt, a lot about Jordan. He hasn't been saying anything about the Qataris. And that's telling to some extent because, yes, Khalid Mashal is supposedly in Qatar, right? They do have Hamas officials there. So why is he not talking about what the Qataris could do more and leave it to everyone's imagination what the reasons might be?
Yeah. And we may speak about that in the coming weeks and months, if and as, depending on how things develop. But for now, he's accomplished in the chaos that he's created and his whole disruptiveness. He's accomplished a fair bit. He's finally put the glare on the fact that the two-state solution has been long dead, right? We know that. Diplomats know it. The foreign policy community knows it. And they've been talking about it behind closed doors for 15 years, openly, that it's dead. It's just not going to happen. Really, it goes back to the second intifada. But it's much easier for everybody to kind of continue on autopilot, right? And pretend. That's over. And Trump is the one who pulled the curtain and said it's over. There is not going to be a two-state in the foreseeable future. Hamas has to go. This is sheer insanity. And blowing up that sclerotic paradigm that everyone was still kind of attorning to, paying attention to, pretending prevailed, I think that was very significant. Whether you like him or not, agree with him or not, that is significant. Okay, so here we are on Wednesday. I'm glad to know, I'm very reassured to know that it's not just me who's confused. The situation is confused and confusing. And I think, yeah, you're probably right. I mean, you were probably trying to make sense out of the news reports last night on Israeli television, and it just didn't make sense, and it still doesn't today. So Israel, the government here, is also in this kind of weird conundrum because, Trump basically gave Israel a green light, open door. He said, do what you need to do. If it was me and all of the hostages were not out by Saturday at noon, I'd go crazy, whatever that means. But you do what you think is right. So, as one commentator said last night on the news, Netanyahu's in a bit of a spot there because he doesn't want to embarrass Trump and reject this very significant overture. or permission that he's given to Israel, right? If he rejects it outright, he may embarrass, humiliate Trump. And then when Israel needs Trump's help and support in the future, he may say, well, why should I do that? I mean, we're dealing with a very kind of fickle, unpredictable guy, right?
Exactly. And I think that this is one of the great challenges that the prime minister has, because when he went into the Oval Office last week, definitely on his mind was what Trump had just announced a couple of days earlier to your former country, Canada, and what he announced about Mexico and what he did to the Colombian president. And yes, there's definitely an affinity and a warmth between Donald Trump and the state of Israel. But if you cross and defy this president, you don't know exactly how that's going to play out. So Netanyahu is trying very carefully to needle a thread between, on the one hand, getting along with the
Hang on, I got to fix it. I'm a sewer. He's trying to thread a needle, not needle a thread.
thread a
right?
needle. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Whoops, needle a thread.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
So the
Save
prime
that.
minister is trying very carefully to thread a needle to be able to, on the one hand, get along with the president,
Right.
seem like he's playing along with him. And that's why, by the way, we saw those conflicting statements that came out that, yeah, I support what the president says, but then he realized, 1 second, that's too far. What if they only release 3 hostages? Do I want I want the hostages. He's trying to keep it all together. This is classic Netanyahu. Classic.
Yeah.
I think what people need to keep in mind, Netanyahu doesn't change, right? He might sometimes become more corrupt. Allegedly, he might be more radical sometimes in his rhetoric, more less sensitive, as we've seen. But he's always he tries the same tactics over and over again. Be in the center, not move too far. Don't make any rash, radical, extreme decisions on any issue at all. And also try to kick the can down the road for as long as possible to keep it all together. The coalition, the relations with America, the ceasefire going. Get Smutrich happy that I'm mobilizing forces because maybe I'm going to renew the war. Keep it all together somehow.
Yeah. Like survive till tomorrow. But unfortunately, the hostages may not survive until tomorrow.
No.
And so he is in very, very risky territory now. There have already been quite a few who have been murdered since this deal could have been made in May, June, July. And based again on what we saw, we can only assume that the others are hanging on by a thread. So it seems to me, we have to wait until Saturday, see what happens. Hamas is pulling back on this deal. I'm not exactly sure why they're doing this zero-sum kind of challenge. Because if they don't release hostages, it is going to be full-on war. And
But what
unfortunately,
happens, Viv, if they release 5 or 4? What do you do? Now, here's an interesting, I was looking at polling today. 70% of Israelis want to see the deal continue. If you look
yes,
into the numbers, about 55% of Netanyahu coalition voters want the deal to continue also. 36% don't, and the rest don't know. But 55% want the deal to continue. On the other hand, 70% of Israelis want Donald Trump's plan to remove out of Gaza all of the people. And I would bet that also a lot of people in this country want us to go back to fighting to destroy Hamas, because clearly they're still there. So you have a lot of competing interests all at the same time, and a group of hostages who are stuck in the middle.
horrific.
Yeah.
All right. So if you were prime minister today, what would you do?
Thank God I'm not, and I
Okay.
would not want to be, but it's a tough call to make. But I think we have to stick with what we've been doing, which is get everyone home. What is the right path forward? Is it this threat? Now, I think that Trump is doing what he thinks has served him until now. Remember, it was Trump's threats before he took the oath of office that helped get us to the first stage of this deal. Trump must be believing to some extent, maybe in coordination with the Israelis who have told him, yeah, that worked, do it again. So he's issuing this new ultimatum, and maybe they think it'll have an impact on Hamas. But maybe it won't. And then we'll be in a situation where they give us, like I said, They choose the middle ground. They release the 3 they're supposed to release. That's it. Does Israel resume fighting or not? Netanyahu's under immense pressure to resume fighting. I would suggest keep saving lives for as long as you can. Going back into Gaza can always take place tomorrow. You can only save these lives now. And you said that. You just said it. The hostages don't have time. So time is against them. It's not every day. It's every minute.
Yeah.
Their lives are in direct existential peril. And the fact, I mean, it's so horrific. I just can't. I was watching a video before of father Ayal Eshel of Roni Eshel, who was one of the
I've met with Eyal a number of times.
one of the Tatzpitaniot, one of the female soldiers who was stationed at Nachal Oz before the on October 7th was murdered. They didn't know initially her body was taken, whatever, was killed. And he's sitting in a meeting of the Knesset Finance Committee. He says to Moshe Gafni, the forever chairman of this committee, an ultra-Orthodox politician, look me in the eyes. Look at me. And Gafni says to him, I don't want to. And Ayal Eshel, this father of a soldier who was killed because of the failure of Gafni and his fellow coalition members, who has, by the way, and you know this, has served in reserves since October 7th with distinction after losing a daughter, says to him, you won't look me...
And his middle child, it was Ronnie, their daughter Yael, and then there's this younger son. Yael was just drafted recently into the IDF.
Okay. And he says to Gafni, you won't look me in the eye. You won't look at me when I talk to you. He says, no. I mean, it's just mind-blowing. The cold-hearted, how cold-hearted these people are. I can't understand it anymore. I just don't. I'm at a loss of words, really, to explain this anymore.
And this is, I have long been at a loss for words. The Prime Minister Netanyahu is clearly not welcome to go and meet with any of the hostages who have been released in the last few weeks, because he has not done so. There were a few that took phone calls with him so he could video it in his office. But he seems not to be welcomed by them. He's still not gone to Nir Oz. He makes himself very, very scarce around anything to do with hostages, except for in June. And he showed up at the hospital, for the big joy and the hugs. I do think, though, I just want to say this anger that people in Israel have, even Likudniks, with Netanyahu and with the coalition government. I think it's taken a while for North American Jews in particular to understand why people here are so angry. It's not a right-left thing. As you said, it's just a common decency, a compassion.
You mentioned Nir Oz. He has been 3 times to the United States of America since October 7th. Nir Oz is a 2-hour drive less, hour and a half from his residence. He'll fly down there. It takes no time. 1 of 4 residents of Nir Oz was either killed or abducted on October 7th. And the prime minister has not had the time. You go there, you stand and you suffer. You hear them yell and cry and scream at you, and you stand there and you apologize. This happened on your watch. The hostages who came home, they might curse you, yell at you, scream at you. Where were you? How you failed them. But you stand there as a leader and you take it. That is the definition of leadership. And it's a complete failure and a shame and a stain. By the way, it's a stain on us as a country that we allow this to continue.
I agree. And on that very depressing note, thanks, Yaakov.
Yeah, anytime.
Yeah. So look, appreciate you finding time to speak today. It's an important day. We're all going to be on the edge of our seats between now and Saturday, and you're going to work on threading that needle, right?
I definitely will.
All
Thank
right.
you, Viv.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Yaakov. Have a good one. Thanks again for being here. You can check out our website, stateoftelaviv.com. We're putting out some really interesting content. I was just in Germany for a week, and there's a lot going on there politically, There's a big federal election coming, and we're going to be having some of the material here, some of the material there. Thanks again for being here. Never a dull moment in this part of the world. And let's hope that this nightmare ends so soon for all of the hostages so that they can come home and begin to heal with their families. See you soon. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.